Hello, I hope that everyone can hear me. It is very good to see everybody once again. So this evening, as we've heard already, what I'm hoping to do is to shed light onto what I think is one of the big pillars of Colchester's history. The story here of the Dutch in Colchester, principally. There are other issues that are attached to this. However, we are talking about that large part of the town called the Dutch Quarter. We're talking about the connection that Colchester and the environs have to that group of people, and how they came here, what they did when they were here, the legacy that they have, those sorts of things. I should say that that I'm not at First Sight this evening. I'm actually at Colchester Art Centre, where Anthony Roberts very kindly has opened the building here. And as I'll come on to, this is a hugely relevant place for me to be able to be broadcasting from this evening to this particular story. So here we're talking, or this particular building would have been the congregational church for many of the Dutch incomers who came to Colchester really from this sort of late part of the 16th century for the next couple of hundred years or so. They would have identified quite closely with this building here. So I feel really very appropriate to be in this building. And indeed, just behind me here, there is a memorial stone to Thomas Mayhew. And it talks, you may be even able to make out just here, a little bit about how they were based both in Colchester and also Leiden in modern day Holland. More of that to come though. I need to start to share some slides with you. So if I just go here, 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 and also here, then I think that that should mean that you can see some slides. Hopefully that will come through just in a moment. Now, some of you may have seen some of the sort of promotional films for this evening that I've been putting out. And if you have, you may have seen one of the films that I did where I was actually in the town hall a few weeks ago with my two boys. And we climbed right up to the top of the stairs just above the moot hall. And we were able to see this painting that you can just see on screen just here. This is from 1913. As I'll come on to, this is part of the sort of the romanticized vision of the Dutch migration into Colchester. It's by a guy called Harry Becker, who was a wonderful local artist to Suffolk, to Colchester, one of two that I'm going to talk about this evening. And he here in this painting that you can see just on my title slide just here is just showing the scene. 1570 this is meant to be, obviously painted in 1913. But here we're meant to see the Dutch, the Dutch, of course, from Flanders, more of that to come, but they arriving into Colchester and being given permission to stay in the town. Let's move on, however, and I can start to talk a little bit more broadly. Now, when I was thinking about this particular story and sharing this particular idea, it was very keen, it's always been very apparent to me that within Colchester's history, we've got this period where there was this large group of refugees who traveled to Colchester, sought refuge here, were given it, contributed enormously to Colchester. And I wanted to see about how that relates to other time periods naturally. And I think that, you know, as Stuart has already referred to, there is a very vibrant community within Colchester and indeed the local area that is supportive of more recent movements of people into the town here. Also pictured just on the slide here, you'll see an image just up the road, Harwich, and of course the late 1930s Kinder transport that came into the UK via that port. So we have, there is a broader, if you like, refugee landscape into which this story that I wish to talk about this evening fits. That is a landscape that is still evolving. It's a landscape that is still very much relevant today. And I think that I heard recently a wonderful saying that that talking about the aspect of history and talking about the relevance of history, we are still living in the dreams of our forefathers. The actions that we undertake, the things that we do, the ideas that we have, the society that we run, all of this has been structured by those people who've gone before. So we need to understand the world that we're in now. Well, then we need to also understand, of course, what the plan was. How did this come to be? And so if we're to understand about the refugee landscape of now, we need to understand about what has gone before, I think. I want to talk, when thinking about this and thinking about the history of Colchester, we need to cast our minds right back. I mean, gosh, we could sort of start off with 43 AD and a group of elephants being mastered by some Italians mooching into the town and building a temple to some fellow called Claudius or so. We could go this far back, of course, but that's missing the point. Really, if we stretch our mind back really to the 13th century, as is mentioned here, David Stevenson, author of the Book of Colchester and a great local Colchester historian of the 1970s, he did a lot of work on the early medieval Jewish population of the town. Interestingly, fascinatingly, this group of people, of course, focused in some of the title deeds and some of the records that we have in and around the Dutch Quarter, that area to the north of High Street, where, as you can see here, we have the medieval Jewish population focused there. As it was, further research shows that they were actually spread a little bit further beyond into Culver Street and also to Head Street. Also areas that were later to be used by the Flemish, the Dutch, in their own settlement of the town. Isaac of Colchester was, of course, the most wealthy of the Jewish people living here before they were banished in the 13th century. But Aaron of Colchester also, just in this image just here on the right-hand side, another example of the early Jewish population within the town. I think interesting, looking at this and then coming on to the Flemings in a moment, these people had a very unhappy experience of their time in Colchester. The Jewish population, for example, as I've already alluded to, ultimately banished, and along with the entire population of Jewish people from England at that time. The buildings that the Jewish people owned forfeited, their fortunes taken from them. A similar negative experience, of course, held by those Flemish settlers who came in the early period of migration, I suppose, and immigration of refugees into Colchester, into East Anglia, into, in fact, the whole east coast of England. And of course, the county of Flanders, just shown in red, just on the map on the right-hand side. Now, what we know is that in 1381, the year of the Peasants' Revolt, well, my man John Ball, who I've spent so much time researching, he was, of course, involved in the upswell of aggression and anger that took place in that year. Now, just here, I've drawn attention to the writings in the 1390s of Chaucer. And you can see the way that Chaucer, 10 years on from the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, chose to remember those events. In the background, you can see the original Chaucerian English, in the foreground, a bit of a translation for you. But the point being that in 1381, in addition to moaning very justifiably about the lack of enfranchisement and seeking to protest about the way in which they were being treated in the reign of Richard II, many of those people who were rising up in that year were doing so in a way that it is tempting to see from a 21st century perspective as in a xenophobic fashion. It's tempting to see it that way. Of course, we mustn't. But we know from numerous people, Eric Spindler and his paper on the Flemings and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 talks about the way that in that year, in Manningtree, on the 16th of June, one of the Flemish merchants settled in the town, pulled outside, head chopped off. A similar spate of violence takes place in Colchester during the events of the Peasants' Revolt. And Chaucer here referring to what happened when Wat Tyler and John Ball and the very loosely controlled, of course, peasants, in inverted commas, of the 1381 uprising, when they made their way into London, well, one of the atrocities that took place in that very loosely controlled uprising was the summary execution of many Flemish people settled in the town. People who'd come here following on from the trades that the Hanseatic League had been running through Northern Europe and into the steel yard in London. Well, these Flemish people had settled there. There had been tension between the local population and those Flemish people in the decade or so prior to 1381. But in 1381, of course, we see acts of brutality in Manningtree, for goodness sake. It was quite a widespread phenomenon. Not, therefore, a happy account from history of relations between incoming populations and a resident population. If we move on, we come into the period that I'm most, I suppose, intrigued by for the purposes of this evening. We look at the reign of Mary, and we can see that we had, at that time, obviously, we've gone through the early stages of the Reformation. We have the Calvinists from the Low Countries making inroads, and the Lollardy making inroads into the east of England. Well, we start to see a resident population of Flemish people starting to be referred to, as you can see just down here, as the Dutch, D-E-W-T-C-H, and these populations starting to become far more resident in Colchester from that period. John Johnson was paying extra subsidies, or sorry, paying extra fees that you would associate with him being a inverted commas foreigner or an alien. Now that identifies him as being a Dutch person. That means that he is therefore quite an interesting candidate for one of the burnings that you can see illustrated just here that took place during the reign of Mary on the 2nd of August 1557. Well, we have the day when 10 people were taken up to the castle, just where there's those lovely attractive flower beds just outside the castle. Scenes like this were taking place, and one of those people being burnt here is a Dutch migrant coming into Colchester. I think it's quite fascinating that the ideology of those people coming in, as we'll see with this story developing, the religious ideology of the Dutch moving into Colchester as refugees later, they hold on to that incredibly strongly as part of their identity. And it's therefore no surprise possibly that in the counter-reformatory reign of Mary, then we would see some of those Protestant ideas from the Low Countries being affiliated with Protestants that are already within the local population. It's no surprise that we have Dutch people being burnt in Colchester, perhaps. At that stage, however, quite a low level of settlement. We've had a small number of people. You can see here 53, inverted commas, aliens living in the borough. And some of these wonderful names, Winking Greenrice, from 1525, a burgess and a town councillor making inroads into the local politics, and actually having a sort of quite instrumental role to play in the town. Interesting, therefore, that that these people are settling, but this is not the wave of refugees that we are coming onto, of course. Now, in the reign of Mary, we do find that anybody with an ecclesiastical position in the UK, or sorry, in England, who was a Protestant, Lollard, Calvinist intent, then these people become what we refer to as the Marian exiles. Those people who flee essentially to the Low Countries, to Germany, which are reasonably sympathetic to their ideology, but anywhere but being in England, whilst Mary is, of course, leading the Counter-Reformation. And Edmund Grindal, who would go on to become the Bishop of London, he becomes crucial to our story. Now, he is one of those people in the reign of Mary. So Mary, of course, the eldest daughter of Henry VIII, who following on from Henry VIII, and then his son, Edward VI, then we have Mary, who seeks to turn back the clock, take us back to Catholicism, and all of those people who'd sort of bloomed with their Protestant ideals in the reign of Edward, and to a lesser extent with Henry. Well, these people are fleeing, these Marian exiles. Now, what's interesting is, of course, they flee to a place where they feel safe. But then, of course, we introduce on the right-hand side of the screen just here, Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the third Duke of Alba, who goes under the reign of Philip II to what we know as the Spanish Netherlands. And he then, if Edmund Grindal was fleeing to Holland before because of religious turmoil in his native country, Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, I have to be careful how I say that, will start a wave of migrants, refugees, fleeing from their own homes in the Low Country, coming back the other way. So, of course, after Mary's reign of 5 years, then we come on to her little sister Elizabeth, and Elizabeth far more sympathetic to the Protestant cause. And those Marian exiles, Edmund Grindal amongst them, well, then they're accepting people back the other way. There's a man called John Utenhove. Now, he is one of those people who is seeing the Duke of Alva's real resentment, I suppose, to Protestantism. Then he, clearly of Dutch descent, he appeals to Edmund. Now, we don't know about the extent of Edmund's connections. I don't know. I'm afraid I needed to research it more, but I do not believe that we know extensively the extent of Edmund's connections within the Low Countries. But it's interesting that we have Grindal being Edmund Grindal, not John as they've written there, forgive me, but Edmund Grindal being approached by Utenhove asking for permission to settle in Colchester. I've written that Sandwich in Kent is a crucial place in this story as well at this point. Sandwich was the sort of the entry point. As we'll come on to, they have some wonderful architecture there still from their Dutch population. Interestingly, Sandwich became saturated, for want of a better phrase, with the a Dutch in moving population very quickly, and became very resentful towards it. And so a lot of Dutch people moving in are then moving very quickly from Sandwich through to Colchester. Approval of the Privy Council, as I'll come on to, was given quite quickly. And it's worth, I think, talking just a little bit about what this movement of refugees that we see in that later period of the 16th century, what they were seeking to get away from. Mechelen, which is now in Belgium, but Mechelen in 1572, actually, well, there's something called the Spanish Fury that took place. The Siege of Haarlem, equally violent. And the Duke of Alba is seen just in the bottom left here, chairing something that the Spanish calls the Council of Troubles, which sounds quite diplomatic. The Dutch have another name for it. They call it the Court of Blood, because of the number of people who were sentenced and then executed on the basis of their religious affiliation. So that's everything that is going on in Holland, or in the Dutch territories. And this is the desire that they are keen to get away from. Oh, I have to point out just here, just on the right-hand side, there is a little special hat that was given to the Duke of Alba by the Pope, which I think is quite nice. He was very much designated as the Pope's man, and was given a special little hat to carry out his bloody duty. There we go. Anyway, so we come to Harry Becker's painting. Now, obviously, this is a fantasy of the scene as they imagine it, but you can see in this painting the Dutch arriving to the table. You can tell it's in Colchester because there's a little seal, there's the little coat of arms, I should say, and we have the title of Harry Becker's painting: "The Dutch Refugees Fleeing from the Persecution of the Duke of Alva," and here they are arriving, looking all very friendly. Now they were very well respected they had, there was problems with the local population. I'll come on to that in a moment. But they were very well respected. They were, when they first arrived, many people in the town were very quick to talk about the way that the Dutch people who arrived were very godly, were very extremely well ordered, and that they were welcome to increase God's glory and maintenance of His word. It seemed like a perfect fit, and this is what comes down to, or it comes back to, I suppose, the title of this talk. The Dutch are the refugees in this piece. The Dutch are fleeing from the violence, the 80-year war in Holland that goes on for some time. You don't need me to tell you that. So this violence that's taking place, we have a group of people fleeing that. A familiar story. They are extremely skillful. They come to Colchester, and at this stage, you have Colchester is stagnating economically. The returns that the town had been giving were at one point sort of ranked, if you like, at around about 11th in the country. So similar possibly in terms of economic output to something like Leeds today. But they were slipping, they had been slipping for several decades. And the people of the town were quite keen, frankly. I think they saw huge opportunity here. And what they heard about the fact that these people were keen to find a safe new home. Remember, of course, that in the 16th century, there had already been Hanseatic trade coming into Colchester. There had already been the trade of the wool towns. And then, of course, we had already seen the populations of Flemish people moving in that I've mentioned already. So we've got a town that is economically stagnating, that sees huge opportunity here, and they welcome the chance to give a home to initially 11 families. Initially 11 families come over. But that escalates very quickly. What I love is this quote that I've just put down just at the bottom here. Such sciences are not usual with us. There was a letter that was sent by the authorities in Colchester to the Privy Council. And they essentially said, look, these people have turned up, we're keeping them warm, we don't want to do anything wrong, we hope that's okay, but they have this wonderful skill with making cloth. They have such sciences are not usual to us in the way that they make their wool, famous bays and says that we'll come on to. And they waited for a reply, and the reply came through from Walsingham just saying, great idea, good, make sure they behave themselves. And Walsingham says to the people of the town, absolutely, make sure that they do not lead to any religious problems, make sure that they are well kept for, but this is very seen as a great opportunity by both the local authorities and also the central authorities in London. This is fascinating. This is fascinating. When I know about, having grown up in Colchester, having spent a lot of time studying the history of the town, I've always had it in my head before researching this evening that movement of people, that story I was very familiar with, the fact that there were a group of people, refugees, seeking to come away, and they were offered a home and they contributed economically to Colchester. But they were, on two counts, really quite muscular. I don't know why they shouldn't be. I think that in my mind, I suppose I just had integration being my overwhelming approach to how I perceived this must have happened. But it wasn't like that at all. The wars that were taking place in the Low Countries were still very much live when this population started to increase. And it got to the point, and I haven't drawn enough attention to that back here, but certainly by the turn of the century, certainly by the end of Elizabeth's reign, you've got to anticipate that in Colchester, you had, bear in mind the population of the town at the time was around about 10,000. You've got about 2,000 people have turned up. Dutch-speaking people have turned up, 2,000 of them in a town that's got a population of 10,000. The equivalent today is 40,000 people turning up in Colchester. And they arrive, and yes, they've got their skills. Yes, they've got their skills in terms of the bays and says manufacture and such like. But they arrive full formed. I've got a list here that they had with them their own ministers. They had their own doctors. They had their own tutors. They had a whole community was brought over, and it was very keen they were very keen to maintain the integrity of that community, not just in Colchester though, but they were keen to maintain close connections with home. I remember seeing the historian Michael Wood talking about the way that in North America, in the United States, the Italian-American community would maintain or attempt to maintain close connections with home. That you would see similar connections made by other diaspora communities in the United States. Well, we see a similar thing taking place here. And we've got records of the fact that on one point, 34 troops were kitted out with arquebus muskets, were put onto a ship and essentially as a sort of war party sent back to fight in the conflict in the Low Countries against the Spanish. So you've got this, the idea that the population here has transplanted itself, great, but is also then seeking to maintain very close connections and indeed kitting out men of the Colchester Dutch community with weapons in order to go and fight for their home country. And I do believe that they would have referred to Holland as their home. I do not believe, having researched this and looked at several documents here, that in this phase at least, they would have been regarding England as a home. I'll come on to why. So they are making a lot of money here. They're able to, if we look at the way in which they are building up their funds, then we're able to chart that in the amount of money that they are being taxed, essentially. They were being double taxed as immigrants and as in inverted commas, aliens. So they would have faced a greater level of taxation than the resident population. And very, very clear records were kept. Just looking through here. So Godfrey, who is mentioned on the slide, he was in St. Leonard's parish, born in Gelderland, assessed on £63 in goods in 1524, but that is going up and is going up. And you see that the growth of the economic growth of several of these characters who've come into the town, and they're producing this material. Of course, you may have, if we know of the snooker, of course, it's referred to as the baize. Well, this is back the original baize and says. Says was sort of a brown cloth. These were very well-respected materials. As again, I'm afraid that phrase, as I'll come on to, Colchester baize and says produced by the Dutch here, people who bought it all over Europe didn't even need to look at it. There was a very sort of meticulous checking process that went on in a very special building that I'm going to show you in a short time, and that they had a seal. So every bundle of baize and says had a seal that was given, Colchester baize and says, and just the seal alone. Nobody needed to look inside the packet. Nobody needed to look at the material. It would go just on the seal alone. I've mentioned just here about Hadley as well. Now, there was a Dutch population that moved up to Hadley. This was decided that this would be a good idea, and the people of Hadley were rather divided on the subject. And this is where we need to mention about this idea for the first time, about the idea that we have people who are pro and people who are against. Sounds familiar? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That idea that we have people who are very supportive of the strength and the opportunity of a refugee population, or have closer ties even across Europe. Some people see this as a great benefit. Other people, obviously, even today, obviously, as we know, less keen on that that idea. And in Hadley, well, in Hadley, we get a very clear indication about that. The authorities in Hadley very, very keen for there to be a Dutch population because they see the merits of the cloth production, of the skills of the people there, and they want that set up in Hadley. They want them to be producing those materials in Hadley for them to sell. But for some reason, we don't know precisely, but by the time we get into the sort of late 1570s, then many people in Hadley, or sorry, many of the Dutch are sort of coming back to the much larger population that is now existing in Colchester. And in the people in Hadley, the authorities in Hadley and Great Yeldham and Sybil Headingham, they write to the Dutch community in Colchester, and they say, please, and also to the Dutch community in London. And they say, please come back. We need you. We want the skills that you have. We want the money that you're bringing in. It didn't come to anything though. And we can imagine the level of resentment from the local population that was potentially motivating that group to come away from Hadley and back to Colchester. Okay, I want to pause just at that point just for some questions. I'm going to pause a couple of times during the course of the talk, as I did before, if anybody recalls that one, just to pick up some questions, and then before we move on to the next section. So just have a look at some questions that have just come through just here. So Pam Nelson, yes, okay, the photo captions give names which sound English and not Dutch. I'm terribly sorry about that, but we'll try to get those fixed, I think. Kathy Groslin, though, asks the question, hello, please could you give us some examples of the types of restrictions, lacks of liberty, etc., that 16th century Dutch Protestants suffered under Spanish rule? For example, were they allowed freedom of worship? No, and that's a crucial point. So many of the people in the area that was the Spanish Netherlands that had come into the ownership of the Spanish royal family, of course, then many of those people there were religious freedom. Sorry, was the main problem that they faced, and many were forced either to convert to Catholicism or to flee. Some of them fled north, later especially, but many of them fled across the sea and came over to newly Elizabethan England, of course, that was much more tolerant at that point and seemed to be a safe haven for the Dutch population. So we had people, principally I think that their main concern was their religious freedom. They didn't have any, and of course at that time the importance of that cannot be overstated. Anything in terms of the 17th century, anything in terms of the 16th century, if you're looking for what is motivating people, is to do with religion in Europe at that time. And of course it was very brutal. The way in which the people were being treated. As we've seen, the Council of Blood was the way in which we saw, or the Dutch saw, many of the Spanish interventions at the time. The Spanish fury at Mechlin, 1572. Yeah, I mean, it was a particularly bloody and violent conflict that was taking place at that time. Sue Clark has just come through here and said, did their religious practices differ very much from those of the local population? Aha, interesting. And that is where we're going to be going to now. Probably not largely. However, they did seek to maintain their own congregation. I'm going to come on to that now, if that is okay. So if I can just move those questions for now. And then we'll come back to those in a second. Right, so let's press on. So the next section, insularism, sorry, and success. Now here we have, in preparation for this evening, I've done an awful lot of digging around of quite well-known articles, but also had the opportunity to look at some really quite rare and interesting artifacts. And the one on the right just here is an absolutely fantastic document just here. This is by, you can just see him actually, I have to try to move my document at the front so you can see Francis Tayspill. Well, the Tayspills are one of the Dutch families that make an absolute fortune from the Bay and Say industry, and associated works. Very, very industrious, the refugees who've come across from Holland, and the way in which they're working. And they very quickly move to a position where they are dominant economically within the town. Now, as per my last talk, 1648, we had the siege of Colchester in the English Civil War. Now, it's the part of Tom Fairfax's sort of resolution to the siege was that he wanted to be able to pay his own men apart from anything else. But he imposed a huge fine onto the town, the vast majority of which was paid for by the wealthiest people in the town, and the wealthiest people in the town were people like the Tastebills. These were members of the Dutch congregation. Come back to that question that was mentioned a moment ago. And here we see this record from 1648 that shows about the huge payment that was made to Fairfax from the Tastebills, following on from the end of the siege of August 1648, essentially for as a fine, imposed upon the town. So the Tastebills and also the Rebos, more of them to come, these hugely influential families that are starting to make themselves well known within Colchester. But what's interesting is that, for example, Francis Tastebill here would have spoken Dutch with English, but would have spoken Dutch. How do we know this? This is a group who wished to maintain their integrity. This is a group that wished not to integrate completely. This is a group that wished to maintain their distinct culture and indeed their independence from the local community. And you can see a couple of those Tastebills just here staring back at us. It's fascinating to think a little bit of what their experience of Colchester was like. As I sit here in this building just now, I know that these men definitely came into this building. These men here may well have walked into this room, and it's quite remarkable to think of this. But so the Tastebills, the Rebos, these very influential families that become almost a sort of a lay immigrant refugee economic success story, and then a powerful lobby in the town. And their community wasn't in the Dutch Quarter at all. That is a later romanticized version of where the Dutch were to be found. They weren't down there. Well, they were. I'm sure that there were Dutch people right at the bottom of North Hill. Now, just leading through to St. Peter Street, then you've got what was Dutch Lane down there. But these two areas that I've circled just here, this is from the iconography, which is in Morant's History and Antiquities of the County of Essex. And here we can see, I think I can just pull my cursor just here. So I'm in this building here just this evening, St. Mary at the Walls, as it was, the Art Centre now. Now, just over here, we've got what would have been the Dutch church. In 1677, which was the year of the Treaty of Alliance between England and Holland, the year when there was genuinely, in the Treaty of Westminster, genuine discussion about whether or not England and Holland should fuse into one country, one Dutch country. That was genuinely suggested. It wasn't sort of a pipe dream. That was, the sort of the discussion in Parliament phase. But 1677, we've got the cementing. And remember, this is over 100 years since we've got the first mass exodus of Dutch people coming to Colchester. 100 years. Then at that point, in Holland, in a place called Veer, which I'll show you on a map, then in this town of Veer, we had the creation of a prefabricated church, which was then put onto a boat, sent over to Colchester, measured up, prefabricated in Holland, sent on a boat, came over here and put up on this corner. So on Head Street, it's where now there's a bar here. The Odeon is sort of about here. This is Head Street just here. And on this corner, this sort of quadrangle, then this is we can see there's a description that I have of the Dutch church that was just located on that corner. We do have a description, but that's all we've got, frustratingly. We don't have pictures of it. It's a bit of a spoiler alert. We know that the Dutch community has dwindled and changed, not passed away completely. But the Dutch congregation ceased to function in the 1720s. The building here became a bazaar, sort of emporia, shop, and burnt down in 1835. And subsequently, the buildings that we see there constructed now are constructed on that site. I'm yet to find a drawing of the Dutch church, though. I'm absolutely desperate to track one down. But it was brick built in part. It was timber. As I say, from Philip Morant, we've got a description of precisely what that looked like. And if we look for some ideas of what that might have been, well, we can see here, I mentioned sandwich to you before in Kent, and the Dutch church sandwich. Now there's a phrase, isn't it? But here is the Dutch community before they were really pushed out of Sandwich. Then you can see here, look at that church building. And what I think is fascinating is that I remember Martin Newell in Wivenhoe, he talked a little bit about he was interested by how around here, certainly on the road out to Elmstead, we've got some buildings that have those sort of gable ends that look very much like they've come flat packed from the Low Countries. Well, there's one. And we may have had a building not dissimilar to that, just down the lane here, just on the corner of Head Street. There are other examples of Dutch churches still around. Around Austin Friars in London, of course, there is the Dutch church. Don't look at that one, though, because it's not a very good inspiration of what our one in Colchester may have looked like, because that one was built in 1955 after the original was destroyed in the Blitz. But that's the original in London. Not much of a church tower on it, but an interestingly similar school of architecture, I think, just with a few tweaks, a few differences. You can just see the small structure just at the top. A few differences. The question that came a moment ago, was the method of worship much different from that existed in Colchester before? Well, the same but different. Different but the same. I was determined to try and find an example, though, of what our building may have looked like. As I say, ours, we know, was flat packed in Veer. Now, Veer, if you go into Zeeland, Veer is down here on my little map here. Just around here. This is the North Sea just out here, and we're, of course, just over that way. Veer is here. 10 years later, in Katz, this church was constructed. And it's kind of tempting to see if there are architectural elements here that maybe might have sort of leached into the design that we've lost, sadly, but was just down the lane here. Now, but what I find fascinating is that 100 years, 3-4 generations after the original movement of people to Colchester, 1570, we've got them constructing a congregational church. And as you say, I mean, as the question came a moment ago, their method of worship is not as though they are celebrating a different religion. These are Lollards, these are Calvinists. They would have had a very similar school of worship to the local Protestant community, especially after the 1640s. So why on earth in 1677 are they still maintaining and having this shipped over? And it's tempting to see that we got this proud Dutch congregation seeking to maintain connections with home. It's not the only building, though. It's not the only building that sort of speaks of the nature of the Dutch congregation and community and how they were very much asserting themselves across Colchester. Because here we have got the Dean's 1748 prospect of Colchester. It's a wonderful, wonderful drawing. And here you can see the Roman walls. So here you're sort of positioned, where are you positioned here? Near North Station, I suppose. And we're looking down towards Colchester. And if you can just see my cursor just here, well, you can see the Roman walls, that you can still see in Castle Park. There they are. So Duncan's Gate, somewhere up here. No, it isn't in there. And then we've got St. James the Great's Church is just here. The wall coming across here. And then just at the top over here, we've got North Hill, North Gate, still standing. And then coming up here, North Hill, there's St. Peter's Church Tower just there. And then here, this little building. When I say little, I mean big. This building, which sticks out, and I don't believe you would have been able to see it like that. I think it's been drawn to show it, even in 1748, as sticking out quite like that. I think if I move on here, yeah, I've got it a little bit bigger from where I was looking at it. There's the same drawing here. Look at that, beautiful. You can just see those gable ends. That's North Gate there, that building just at the bottom, still standing. You would have had to go through the gate in 1748 to come into the town, and you would have clip-clopped up North Hill. And then look at this building here, just next to St. Peter's Church, we've got this building, remarkable building. This isn't the Dutch church. This is the second of the Dutch influence, huge buildings at the core of the Dutch community. Of course, here is the Dutch Quarter. Well, they're not there, they're over here. This is the Dutch Bay Hall. There you see it again, just in a bit more detail. We can't get too close, we're going to go completely fuzzy. But this is it. This is the Dutch Bay Hall. Forgive me for getting a bit giddy and excited. This is the only drawing that exists of this building. It's the only drawing that exists. And I had to beg the Borough Council to let me look at it because, of course, I can't get into the archives because of the lockdown. And they were very kind, though, I should say. Thank you very much, Borough Council, who sent this to me from the archives. And it's, just imagine that. Just imagine that building there. Now, there were two halls. There was the hall for checking, and there was an incredibly extensive community of people whose job it was to check the materials, the bays and says that they were making. They had, here we go. So this is taken from David Stevenson's Book of Colchester, 1978, a wonderful work of local history here. And we've got here a description of what was taking place in this hall. From their Bay Hall at the western end of High Street, the Dutch regulated the production of the new draperies, as they were called. So these are the bays and says, the new draperies. And they inspected the cloth at several stages in the production. And they levied fines known as rawboats on anyone, Dutch or English, who turned out defective work. And to maintain this inspection process, just imagine the mad bureaucracy at this point. So in this point, if we're looking in sort of this building in operation sort of in the 1600s, mostly. I mean, the siege, 1648, cannonballs whizzing over the roof of this. At that point, to maintain the inspection process, there was a formidable staff of officials who were employed at the building. There were 6 printers in the loom, 15 raw haulers who inspected the cloth at an early stage in its production, 12 white haulers checking it at a more finished stage. Essentially, there was a raw haul on one side and the white hall on the other, where the finished materials were sort of bagged up, checking it in a more finished stage. 1 measurer and assistant, 2 high sealers, 1 hall keeper and bookkeeper, and 4 hall keepers' assistants, a bailiff and 5 assistants, 10 searchers of the tenants who checked for substandard cloth as it was stretched over the tenter frames, which stood thickly in the fields around the town, and 3 provers of the bays. Once subjected to the rigorous scrutiny of this army of officials, Stevenson has written here, the cloth was sealed and for generations was purchased abroad on the strength of the seals alone. And look, I've got some of the seals for you just here. These are the seals, Colchester seals of bays and says, that would have been stamped on. And as I've said earlier, that was enough. If you were in Paris and you wanted bays and says from Colchester, you looked at that, that was good enough for you. You knew that this was of that quality. It was that level of scrutiny and control that was taking place in this building. And that, I think, is absolutely astonishing. That over 100 years afterwards, in fact, I mean, we just saw that in 1748, this building still stood at the top of Cornhill, so up North Hill, turn left, just there. And this small army of people, they were elected officials, these people, all of them elected every year. And they would have been from the Dutch community. Now, and they were exerting their authority over the English. There's the cause of a little bit of resentment, as I'm sure we'll come on to. But this is at the highest point on the high street, the big building here with elements of Dutch architecture about it, exerting control. And it's a group of people who are keen to maintain their integrity. So at this point, and in the drawing that we've just seen, or sorry, the prospect that we've just seen, 1748, that Dutch church still standing, the congregation having dwindled by that point. But can we imagine that at the end of the 1600s, where we've got, after 1677, we've got the Dutch church, and then just over the road, over Head Street, you would be seeing this building here, the two twin Dutch buildings of this Dutch community. But at that point, it's probably shifted a little bit by that point. We don't have an accurate record. We know the numbers who came in originally, but at one point there was 20% of the population of this town spoke Dutch as a first language. And they had these huge buildings. They came as refugees. The local authorities saw them as an opportunity, essentially saw them as an opportunity, saw it as an opportunity, got them in, got them working, and wow, look at this, it's incredible. And a friend of mine did that. Thank you, Nick. But it was, which is quite an amazing bit of computer, well, beyond me anyway. So yeah, it's very well positioned there, and you can see where it would have been stood, pretty much where the fire building is today. So lovely stuff. We can see where that would have been located. I think it's huge. I think it's enormous. And you know, I think that one of our interpretation boards, at very least, should be put up over the road from there, so that we can think about this. 1 in 5 of the population speaking Dutch as a first language. The huge economic growth that these people are bringing to Colchester. It's enormous. Back to questions. Right, let's just see how some questions have been coming along. So I need to look here, and I can see some questions. Oh, there we go. Where the bays and says were woven. Was it domestic labor, looms set up in people's homes? Yes. There would have been some weaving halls. We know that some of them, you know, and this is part of the reason for coming to Colchester, was that there was a tradition of weaving here. But there would have been communities of, sorry, buildings that specialized in this. I know, talked to Barbara Butler about the building that's just opposite John Ball Walk at the bottom of Stockwell Street. Then yes, that would have been a weaving hall. But I think that we can see that there were also, you've got this huge building dedicated to the checking, but also the production on the high street. But yes, I think we can imagine sort of, you know, in that pre-industrial age, we've got to imagine that there were some buildings that would have had a specific focus. But we see this around the world today, in other locations as well, where you can imagine that in domestic settings, some of this weaving is taking place as well. But as I've just explained, the checking and the sealing and the stamp of approval, if you like, is all taking place at the Bay Hall just on the High Street. Okay, so I don't think we've got any other questions just at the moment. If you do have any more, I will be answering some questions in a moment. We'll see some more questions in a short time. Let's take a quick look now. I just want to move on to think about the just here on the what then happens to the congregation. And this is a fascinating document that I found at the University Library. This is from 1707 and shows the new minister for the Dutch church who had been appointed at that time. And it is quite hilarious. So this is Cornelius Peter Schrievlius, who comes in at that point. Forgive my absolute assassination of the pronunciation of his surname. And he arrives and gives this sermon at that church down the road from here in 1707 in Dutch. Amazing. And he later on in the sermon, he talks about the fact that he hoped to do all of his jobs in his native land, but God had called him, and he went to the Dutch community in Colchester. But it is fascinating. Again, I think that we've got here a group of people who are who have called to the home country to bring over. By this point, the wars have passed. By this point, things have moved on politically. There is not the danger of being in Holland. The wars have passed, and yet we're still hearkening back to the home country to see how if we can have more people coming through to maintain that connection. The insular nature of the community, or the insular, possibly the wrong word, holding on to its cultural roots, though, certainly. But we do start to see how people are spreading out. And I do need to just talk about this. This is Isaac Rebo. He was MP for Colchester, of a Dutch family. And of course, when we get to after James II, William and Mary, William of Orange is Dutch. And Rebo is able to achieve what many other people are not. And that is get William to his home. So if you walk down Head Street, you'll see this plaque showing that William turns up. Now, why is that important? How the Dutch saved Colchester, how refugees saved Colchester. They were as late as the late 1600s into the 1700s, then you were able to see 1690s, these visits taking place. Well, by 1699, 1698, 99, we start to get the benefits, the political benefits of knowing a Dutch community with a Dutch sovereign in charge of the country. And here we go, 1697, 8. Remember, 120, 130 years nearly after the first influx. Then we've got here the political rub of that population, being able to exert, we are the Dutch population of Colchester, and wouldn't you like to engage with us? Thank you very much. And what happens at that point is we get the Hythe in the modern sense. So this is after several attempts to petition for assistance to dig the channel through to the Hythe for larger ships. For a very long time, ships have come up into Colchester and parked here essentially. And this is, we know this is Old Heath Road, Old Hythe Road. Well, the old docks were down here in Fingeringham. Really, there would have been lighter vessels that could have gone all the way up here, smaller boats that would have taken things up here, but the big ships couldn't do that. So what we get is the canalization of the River Colne to take us through to the Hythe. And if we look at this structure here, if you look closely, you'll see what it was like. This is the route of the river as was, and it was William of Orange's act that was petitioned for by the Isaac Rebo. Well, that is what got us this canalized, for want of a better phrase, River Colne that leads to the creation of the Hythe proper. And we can see here that this is the description is taken from the Britannia History, actually, that talks about the way in which this the works of that time, late 1600s, smashed through this piece of land, this bit of land, to create this modern channel that we see here. Okay, I've got a few more things to do. I'm just going to move on quickly through those, though, because I'm very conscious of time, so that we can talk just a couple more slides, and then I'll take some questions just at the end, if that is okay. Okay. Just talking about the legacy, a little bit about the legacy. Now, this fascinating document you can see on the left here is the record of baptisms that would have taken place at that church just down the road here, the Dutch church. And you can see it comes to an end in 1728, where you can see Maria van Jacobus de Bruin. On the December 22nd. And it's quite sad reading through this, because just behind you can see how at the start of the period, huge lists of baptisms coming out every year, and then down to the last one in 1728, just one. And the congregation dwindling. But at the same time, in terms of religious difference, we see the intermarriage of the Dutch families, the Taysbills here, into the Quaker registry. And that idea of religious toleration that I think is always built into the hardwired into the DNA of Colcestrians at that point, 1570 and through, well, then it starts to mature. Religious toleration, Quakers Court, here it is, in the Dutch Quarter. There we go, that's now the townhouse, just down Stockwell Street. Well, that's one of the drawings of the Dutch Quarter by Major Bale, who was an artist of the late 19th, early 20th century. But the Quakers, of course, they have their the Quaker burial ground just inside the town walls, just off Roman Road and Castle Road. And this idea, I think I'm just referring to it very briefly now, but religious toleration in Colchester is a thing. It has a very long and proven track record. Religious toleration, it's something that Colchester does incredibly well historically. And it comes, I think, from the influx of the Dutch. and it comes from the way in which populations were brought in, and the benefit was seen. The benefit was seen by many. Major Bale, as I've mentioned, well, he did some beautiful drawings in a period of the late 19th and early 20th century, where really this was being starting to be romanticized quite a great deal. These drawings all are for the Dutch Quarter. This is Dutch Lane on the right-hand side. Beautiful drawings, all in the Colchester Borough Council collection. And then, of course, the Dutch Quarter. Well, that name never really reflects the 16th or 17th century at all. But here we can see, this is actually from the Coventry Evening Telegraph of 1955. But the Dutch Quarter, that name in the 20th century becomes a thing. And really, I think it's a little bit of a marketing spin, and it's a little bit of a preservation spin. But it's about making sure that we can try to identify something modern. As I've sort of mentioned, though, the majority of buildings, the most influential buildings, actually had nothing to do with the Dutch Quarter. They were much more over towards Head Street. Reigate House, another of Bale's drawings there. Just have to mention this as well, though, the romanticization of the Dutch in Colchester. This was a real thing in the late Victorian period, the romanticizing so many different things. If you remember my talk on the Civil War, well, they were in an absolute spin about what to do with the execution of Lucas and Lyle. You look at Barclays Bank, you may not know that it used to look like that. So in the late Victorian period, it was architect Ernest C. Lee. Normally he did churches, very sort of normal designed churches. There we go, there's him on the left-hand side. In Colchester, it went completely bananas. It's like Little Bruges on a hill. That was his design for what is now Barclays Bank. Absolutely the town latching on to its Dutch heritage, which I think we should do far more of today. 1 in 5 people being a Dutch speaker at one point. Absolute crackers. But there we go, Nigel smiling at us all, bless him. If we look to today and we look for historic parallels of the past, we must remember that it was not without criticism. I can't go into every detail right now. There's a huge part to this story, and I've gone into elements of it. But we saw in the past, we saw in the, certainly in 1580, I've got records here of priests and ministers in Colchester pleading for the Dutch to remain. There was a great push against incoming communities from some people who perceived it to be an economic threat, but it wasn't. In the example of the Dutch coming into Colchester, certainly in that example, it was a huge economic boon for the town. It was an opportunity that many people in positions of power in Colchester in the 1570s and central government as well, they saw this as a huge opportunity. They latched on with both hands. Communities in places like Halstead that were pushed out, they then ended up reaching out to the Dutch, come back, because of the potential that was brought from that. I started this talk by saying that the issues that are raised by it are relevant today, and they are. I'm going to pause now, or finish now, really. I've talked far enough about this. But I do want to publish more about this, and I do want to make sure that people can find more about this. So let's just see how we're doing, if there are any questions just here that I can help people with. Let's take a quick look. So Dorian, hello Dorian, I hope you're well. Is it not true that large numbers of boats were sent to Holland to pick up the refugees, Dunkirk style, some from Colchester High? Well, I don't think that, I've certainly not seen any records to that effect myself. I am aware that there was, however, a great deal of connection between Colchester. As I alluded to, then the Dutch community were getting some of their young men, kitting them up, tooling them up, sticking them on a boat and saying, go back and fight for Holland. So there was a great deal of to and fro. As I said, the initial movement probably came via Sandwich, cutting across to Sandwich, which is now inland, but obviously had a port at the time, and then journeying on from there. The people in Sandwich were less initially were welcoming, but then became less sympathetic over time. So I don't know about that, and certainly don't know about Dunkirk style, but I do know that there would have been that sort of slightly disjointed method of getting here, and there would have been a great deal of boat traffic. So why not? Let's say that. Let's say it went down. Anyway, Sarah, I hope you're well. How are you doing, Sarah? Good to see you. Thank you for your help, Sarah. Sarah, should point out, works in the special collections section at Essex University Library. She says, "Hi, David. Not a question, but a thought. It'd be worth exploring the relationship between Bourne Mill, built 1591 by Thomas Lucas, father of Charles, and its relationship to the Dutch church, if one, as architecture of the mill is very similar to the gable end you showed in another city. Also of note, Bourne Mill was leased by Dutch refugees in the 1630s for the Bays and Says production." Now, yes, and I did read about that, and of course, obviously, Bourne Mill is a National Trust property, and they have a section on their website that talks about this. But it is, it's another example of how the Dutch were absolutely meshed in to the industry of the town. And what's interesting actually is that, I haven't mentioned earlier, but in the reign of Charles I, there was a petition from some people saying, look, hang on, whoa, too many Dutch people now in the town. And the Privy Council did write back and reminded the people of Colchester that, hang on, these guys are contributing quite a lot, and a lot of your people are now employed in the industries set up by these refugees who've come along. So probably don't moan too much. Anonymous attendee, hello, anonymous attendee. Why did the Dutch population diminish? Very good question. And as we can see, there's this beautiful, haunting record, really, of the way in which the baptisms go from stacks and stacks and stacks of kids being born and given these very sort of very Dutch names. And that dwindles down to, what was it I said, 1728, I think it was, the last one, and to a single record of that poor girl. Now, what's interesting is that the families, Rebos, Tayspills, they go on. The Tayspills, I tracked them down because they were phenomenally wealthy. They paid off the majority of the town's debt at the end of the Civil War siege. Debt, fine, should be the better way of putting it. And anyway, they ended up in Christchurch in New Zealand. And they married into, let me get this right, they married the Creffields. So George Tayspill, who was the one who paid the big amount of money at the end of the Civil War siege, his daughter, married the Creffields of Creffield Road, just up the way. So you start to get, by the late 17th century, and then certainly into the 18th century, into marriage. And the attempt of the community to sort of keep itself distinct with its own church and own buildings, and obviously preservation of language and that sort of stuff, it starts to break down, essentially. And we get to sort of, it becomes integrated. And the big name families, Rebos, Tayspills, Creffields, they blend together, and it becomes much more. And there's actually the Paxmans, I think, start to feature in that family tree as well. And so you get the notion, and I think we see it with the Bay Hall, that actually this Dutch community morphs in a way into a economic elite of the town, and the Dutch connotation therefore ceases to have the great relevance that it did. But it's fascinating. I mean, I really got a tingle up my spine when I was looking at that congregation, or the sermon that was delivered in 1707 in Dutch and having to be translated into English. I thought that was huge, because all of that time later, and he's still having to use translations. You mentioned that there was a move to unite England and the Netherlands. Yeah, something I'd never heard before, says Kathy Groslin. Yeah, so this is the Treaty of Westminster, I think it was called. And part of this was about the decision for the English to support. So obviously this is after the Civil War, after the restoration of the monarchy, and the decision to support the Dutch in the fight in the Franco-Dutch wars, and there was a genuine move. To be honest, it sort of died a death pretty quick, but it was put forward in Parliament. Two Protestant countries should be together, should be one Protestant country. It wasn't an attempt to create a sort of international Protestant alliance with an emphasis on trade. Yes, essentially, is the short and but nevertheless accurate answer. How will 25th century historians see the early 2000s in Colchester in terms of refugee hospitalities? Says David Beals. What a good question. We live what did I say earlier? I'm going to misquote that horribly. But we live in the dreams of our forefathers. And those people in 5 centuries time, they will be living a life that we set now. Personally, I look to, and growing up in Colchester, I always knew this story. Dutch came, contributed, great. And it's built within me that it strikes me as a huge opportunity whenever you see people with skills. But I don't know. I have to say, I don't know. If we look to things like the Kindertransport, that spirit was partially alive in the 1930s, although if you read about the Kindertransport, it was not as universally welcomed as one would hope. But is that spirit alive today? A question. Was there, Louise says, apologies, I missed the beginning. Hang on, sorry, forgive me, I'm jumping ahead. So Nelke, I hope that's pronounced correctly. So where did the Dutch go and what was the catalyst? Nelke, all right, one who stayed. Where did they go? Well, I think hopefully I've answered that. They sort of intermarried essentially. But what's fascinating is, have you ever met somebody called Godfrey? I have. It's a name from around here. It's a Dutch name. Rouse. Do you know anyone called Rouse? I know several people called Rouse. Dutch name. If you look at many of the names of people who came over and are being fined and are being taxed heavily in that early sort of 1570s, 1580s, there's a lot of names that we would associate with being good old Essex names. And they are nothing of the sort. They have been here for a few hundred years, but they are Dutch names. So where did they go? They're just out there. It's interesting. The first, what was his name? The first priest for the Dutch community, he came across, and he moved very quickly out of the town, and he moved first of all to Greenstead and then to Ardley. So this was happening really early doors. Within a few years, people are moving into the local community. Okay, can we have a more cheerful picture up on the screen? Yes, good call. Let's move that back. Okay, given the numbers of Dutch in the town and their preference to maintain their culture community, what was the level of resentment from Colchester residents and how did it manifest itself? The level of resentment from Colchester residents, 1580 was the pinch point. So you might want to please look into that some more. We're very pressed on time. But yeah, in 1580, that was the real pinch point. A great deal of resentment. Particular issue was in periods of economic turmoil. The Elizabethan period, well known for issues of essentially people begging and struggling economically, and supporting of the poor was a major problem. The poor people in Colchester thought that they should be looked after. The Dutch essentially felt that they should look after their own poor and not those of the Colchester population generally. That led to a lot of resentment, as I'm sure you can imagine. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk about this subject. I look forward to the next talk that I've already started to look at. Colchester was the home for 3 years to Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, the Colchester Years, is my next talk, looking at the politics of the town at that time and how that may have influenced her.
Welcome to First Sight.
First Sight is free for everyone to visit.
However, we rely on donations from people like you to help us show world-class exhibitions,
deliver lots of different activities and events,
and support our local community.
If you can, please support us today with a donation. Your donation can help support art and creativity in our region,
helping us show free exhibitions from local and international artists,
and support young artists through our Young Art Community programme.
Your donation can also help support our local community, helping to fund our Holiday Fund programme to provide 3 days out full of art, sport and nutritious meals, helping families facing financial and social challenges.
With your support, we can continue to provide space both in our amazing building and online, where people can be inspired,
escape the everyday,
discover new viewpoints,
and most importantly, have fun.
Now more than ever, our community needs art and creativity, which means we need your support.
Please donate today and help us stay fantastic, fun and free.
Whatever you can give will make a massive difference.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.